Greetings, friends. I'm going to talk about progress. Are things always getting better? Are things always improving? Things are changing. Or are they changing? Some things are changing. A lot of things stay the same. Are things always getting better? These people who say, well, it's 2020. That's why feminism is a no-brainer. That's why diversity in the workplace is a good thing, right? That's why the riots had to occur in the United States, because this is progress. This is the voice of the oppressed. These people are taking what they deserve because they've been neglected, and they're taking power, and they're speaking with their voice, and this is progress. This is making things better. So the narrative goes. And I think this is a very, besides being dangerous, it's arrogant, it's ignorant to assert that just as the years tick by, that things are getting better. Why? What are the years? The years, as we know them, are relating to the birth of Christ. So it was fundamentally a Christian thing from the beginning, of course. Now everything's been inverted. We live in an inversion where everything that was good is now looked down upon, and everything that was bad is elevated. But I'm getting ahead of myself, just sharing some loose thoughts on the concept of progress, because there is some nuance here, and obviously there is some good quality to progress. Economic progress. I mean, once you start saying social progress, it sounds good, but the reality is that's more of a French and then a Bolshevik idea, which produced a lot of misery, as some of you will know who know anything about history. But then there's the American idea of progress, which is more economic and technological. I mean, maybe you can say that started in Western Europe or in England, but certainly that American optimism, the sense that things are always going to improve. I don't know if Americans think that way now, but 20 years ago, that would have been still a common psychological attitude, like this optimistic attitude. Maybe that's the American dream to an extent, or it's that things are going to get better. The world is going to get better with America playing a role in it. Now that may not be the case anymore, but I'm talking about how people think and feel, and as well as the geopolitical facts on the ground as well. America's not in the same position it was 20 years ago, but anyway, so there's that American idea, and even that, obviously you can find the positives, but as I've discussed when I was discussing the decline of America's man-made landscape by William Kunstler, and many people, authors, academics have shown this, that it's a long process. It's been going on arguably through the 20th century, but it's not just America, but the modern West, a lot of the modern world, it didn't turn out to be so great, even though it gave us all these good technological goodies. I've been reading about the age of Edison here, and that's not what this video is about, but just a brief remark, because I'm not finished the book, but they're talking about the birth of electricity in the late 19th century, and how there were gas lights dominated for decades because it was easier and more reliable, and they had already developed that technology. But it was starting to be replaced by electricity after the 1870s, especially after the 1880s, 1890s. That's when electric light starts to take off on a commercial scale. But before Edison's company was able to put out a commercially successful light bulb, there were these things called arc lights, which weren't like light bulbs at all. They were these very big, large, powerful lights that often were put on towers because they were so bright, and it was just this immense contrast, and it really, like, a lot of people liked it, but some people were like, well, it's nice that we can see at night now, but it's so intense, and it forms huge shadows. When you walk into the shadows, like, it's pitch dark. So it was a technology being developed, and people would come to like electric light later. But it really was a jarring thing for a lot of people that now that sort of enchantment of the night was now gone forever to some extent. And so we get, and of course, then we get everything else that came with it. Our lives are so different from then, thanks largely to technology, which in our own times is the internet, but in a previous generation would have been the car, or several previous generations would have been the car, the highways, and before that, streetcars. But up until the car, humans lived, fairly regular, predictable lifestyle over the ages. I mean, there'd be relatively fewer people in cities and people living in real communities, more rooted to the land. With technology, it enabled us to produce more food and do things like that, but obviously we lost a lot of our cultural traditions. And just like social progress will fail to actually make ordinary people's lives better, economic progress and specifically technological progress will also fail, because now we can see that it all just comes down to transhumanism, that the mind and the machine are essentially the same, and your soul can go into a computer in the future, or you can be cloned perhaps, and it's based on a lie. That's not even based on any demonstrable science. It's all conjecture, and they're going to fail. They'll produce some really horrible, sophisticated robots, for sure. These things will never be human, and they'll probably fulfill a lot of evil in the world. Social progress, this is a different thing. This is a much, maybe more sinister than economic progress, but as we've seen economic progress, that can just lead to the nihilism of pure capitalism with no spiritual founding. But at the same time, I think that's the other side of the coin. Social progress, which develops from the French Revolution, roughly speaking, and then which has its further development in Bolshevism, and then communism, socialism, all of this ideology, which is still with us today, still, informing the top ideologues of Black Lives Matter. They're Marxists, trained Marxists. So that sort of idea comes from maybe trying to satisfy or assuage this feeling of emptiness, because now I don't want to say purely from a Christian standpoint, obviously that's where I'm coming from, but now that God is out of people's lives, but you could just say, well, they have less of a sense of meaning in their life, you could say, but they're making up for this sense of longing that, well, we've fallen, everyone knows that we've fallen away from what I would say is God, or they've fallen away from some good, the good or good. Everyone knows that deep down inside. So some people maybe realize that you have to work not for this world, but for another world, beyond this world, whereas maybe the masses or other, people who can't see that or choose to ignore that, they strive to make heaven on earth, to make this world into a paradise. And part of it is they don't know their history. So it's funny, because progress, you could think in terms of gaining knowledge, there's a Gnostic idea of progress, that you will, you gain self-knowledge, you gain divine knowledge, and eventually attain, but you become like a god. That's what they actually believe, and and knowledge has to do with this. But by the way, Gnostics, or at least maybe not all, but there's this dislike of the body. The body is like a cage, or you have to free yourself from the body. And in the Far Eastern tradition, in Hinduism, it's normal to burn, to cremate the body. Western traditions more like burial. So it's this, and I'll come back to that. But why I'm bringing that up, because of knowledge. You want to attain knowledge, but then what we actually see in practice, in reality, is that a lot of these foot soldiers, and not just the foot soldiers in the streets, but the general people who believe in it, who make up the religion, they don't have a lot of knowledge. So it's kind of like, if they had the knowledge, they would see that these things are repeating and repeating and repeating, and they would recognize it for the deception that it is, because progress is not going to lead to a heaven on earth. It's going to produce more of a hell on earth. And progress is revolution, progress is modern, progress is about this world. Revolution is a modern phenomenon. Yeah, there were obviously rebellions and things in the past, But the modern sense of revolution, and I mean, maybe you could say the English Civil War, but pretty much it's from the French Revolution and more developments in the 19th century, which built upon the intellectual tradition of the Enlightenment, which has its benefits, but the Enlightenment has quite a lot of negatives to it. So I'm quite wary of the Enlightenment because that led us to our modern progressive liberal world. It's all founded on mostly Enlightenment tradition thinking. So the materialism or the sort of narrow rationalism of someone like David Hume. And then, of course, coming with that, we have the theory of evolution and geology. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but that fits in with this. That's another type of progress, kind of like man is progressing from these, or species are progressing from these simple life forms. They can never explain how these life forms came about, but they postulate, and then these life forms slowly develop. And I mean, there's some truth in development there to an extent, but again, I'm not making this all about evolution here because that would take a huge amount of time. But just for the purpose of this video, we don't. It's just as big of a question mark as to whether this happens, and probably it doesn't happen. That there's actually barriers between species because the fossil record shows this. I mean, people endlessly question, like, what do you mean there's no in the fossil record, like, and it just becomes an endless back and forth between the hardcore believers in evolution and people who are skeptical of evolution. We just keep asking, these open-ended, like, where do you see anything? But I mean, they're drawing the same inference, and I could draw a different inference. We're just looking at the fossil record. One sees the progress, others see, well, I see fully formed species, more or less. So anyways, this could go on, this debate could just go on, but basically it's not something you can just, it's something you have to believe in at the end of the day, and it is materialistic. So there's not really much place for the soul, just like there's no place for a creator in evolution. And I think that's why it's a necessary component of our modern thinking. You have to have the evolutionary mindset to make sense of this world, because if men are animals, if men are just sophisticated apes, then that justifies, I mean, really all of this stuff, like turning stuff upside down. And you don't understand that if you want to combat these people that are trying to flip everything upside down, you have to have some sort of deep spiritual foundation. Let me just put it that way. So you don't have that in evolution. That's why people like Sam Harris, they eventually get interested in Buddhism or whatever. And I mean, they're still led astray, I would say, in my personal opinion, but at least you understand that, it's difficult to be a hardcore atheist materialist. They usually fall into something like, maybe it's the occult, maybe it's something Eastern. But speaking of things Eastern, I mean, not all of Eastern traditions is to be shunned. I mean, there's lots of wisdom and knowledge in the Chinese tradition, and you have to have a certain, careful, cautious attitude. But I mean, certainly Chinese medicine, I'd say overall, it's been just as advanced over the centuries as Western medicine. I wouldn't say they always had the same, medical knowledge like after the Renaissance and certain developments with operations, but historically, like they've certainly understood a lot of things. I don't know about bloodletting. There's a lot of quackery there too. But anyways, you do see the wisdom in people like Sun Tzu, The Art of War. But I don't want to get too off topic. But in regards to progress, I know that in the Chinese tradition, I know I'm making a broad stroke, but there's this idea of if the Chinese see something going up, they will assume that it will come down. Not like the American, or at least the former American mindset that if things are going up, they're always going to get better. The land is going to continue to flourish, and the economy is going to continue to develop, and my own personal fortune has a good future, and for my children, they're going to multiply. Chinese might be, well, yeah, maybe or maybe not. I mean, what goes up must come down. And that probably has more of a parallel with pagan traditions. I'm not equating paganism in China at all, at least in this sense. But the idea of cycles, which we see in Hinduism, yuga cycles, I don't think I believe in yuga cycles, although there is some truth to the idea of cycles in history. Yes, you do see, there's cycles in ice ages. So they say. Let's not fall too much into discussing science here, because that's just going to open a whole other discussion of like what can you believe? What's true? Is space real? Is the Earth actually flat? And it's like, okay, let's just leave that aside for now. And to an extent, there's cycles in history, although I don't think it's right to say that it's on this ever-evolving, revolving wheel. Then you're subject to the cycle. How does the cycle control you? How does the cycle control culture? Sure, there's agricultural cycles, there's cycles in the environment, okay, but when it comes down to it, people make decisions. These decisions have far-reaching impacts. That explains a lot of history, and that's why there's also the great man theory of history, which is not discussed anymore, but from what I understand, would have been common teaching up until the end of the 19th century or even the early 20th century. Historians and intellectuals would understand that great men really shape history, and that's why we would talk about, George III or well, I don't know about specifically George III because he was kind of going crazy, but the idea of like a certain monarch with a certain name making decisions, and this includes conspiracies. This is not only conspiracies. You don't want to say everything is conspiracy, but what is a few powerful statesmen getting together in a room and deciding to start a war? Is that not a conspiracy? Maybe they're open about it, so maybe in that sense it's not a conspiracy, but they are deciding to do something which is going to affect history. And maybe you could say, well, they did that because the economy and the land was poor at that time, and that's a cyclical effect. It's like, yeah, okay, fine, but you can never quite pin it down, and you can always imagine an alternate scenario where they didn't actually have to do that. If they had been a different person, they would have not done that at that time. Clearly, you can see that too. So at least consider cycles in progress, but also think of the great man theory of history, which is neglected, is not really taught in our education system anymore. Just for what it's worth in terms of the topic at hand of progress, of course, Christianity would say not so much progress as some degeneration from a better time, and maybe some stasis in between. Feel free to offer your thoughts on this. Are we continually degenerating, or are there periods of calm? Do we regenerate for a little bit? But it seems like we've obviously fallen a lot from the times of Eden, and at certain stages, and you can see this in the lifespans of the people in the Old Testament. They used to live very long. There were giants back then. But is it all a cycle? Not necessarily. It's more linear. And in that sense, maybe, I don't know. It's almost like the original idea of progress, which is like things are progressing to a definite end, an absolute end in the future from an absolute definite beginning. Maybe not so much, but in progress they're always. Maybe that's the difference. Is it's not so tied linearly. Point A, point B in progress, because it's like their future is utopian and egalitarian, and everything's equal in the world. No matter the true nature of things. But that's still, it's vague, it's fuzzy, it's like, it's not, what is your definite location, what actually is going to happen? Maybe that doesn't exist in Christianity either, but there's heaven, there's coming back to God, there's the resurrection. So they have a bit more specific. It's like in the Christian story of creation, specific things happened by specific actors. There's certain stages in history, but it's not this cyclical thing, and not really this evolution. There is some change over time. Certain creatures do not exist now that existed in the past, like dinosaurs. I don't think there's anything contrary of believing in dinosaurs, but basically things stay the same. Things are what they are, just because they're like almost, I don't know, I don't want to misspeak, but they're patterns that reverberate through all reality, like numbers. So are species. So are maybe souls and cult and people. And the body is an image of the divine, of God, and therefore Christians don't want to flee from the body. And I know I'm making broad strokes, but none of this Gnostic consciousness, man, get away from my body. And I've always thought that I would want to be cremated. Recently I've been thinking, I don't know if when I die eventually, hopefully I live a long life, but I don't know, maybe I should just be buried, because it says a lot about your attitude to your body. I just get it out. I'm dead, so burn it. Let my soul escape. It's, well, I mean, in the resurrection, we're going to have bodies. That's the thing. So it really says a lot about how do you think about the body, and why do so many people in progress in that culture today seek to change their bodies, mutilate the body. Well, that's an extreme word, but tattoo the body excessively, piercings, dyeing the hair all sorts of colors, and whatnot, and just superficial appearance in your clothing and your. This is all material fascination and seeking to change things constantly. Change. The wheel is going around and around and around. And yet, is that leading you astray? Is that entirely true? So in this Christian worldview, things are absolutes. We're playing a role in a great story, which I'm not saying isn't part of other worldviews too, but this is the great story of which there's a definite conclusion. And there's hierarchy. There should be a duty or a responsibility system in this hierarchy. Everyone has their place, because the divine authority is for all the universe. And it rejects evolution, rejects Gnosticism, rejects French progress, Bolshevik progress. Hasta luego, amigos.